Hello and good evening to those of you tuning in. It's good to be back and running with another one of these episodes under my belt, especially during the times we're living in. As busy as my schedule gets, it's always nice to be able to kick back and talk some classics every now and then, and today we'll be covering not one, but two films in this episode. This is the first double feature in the series, projecting David Cronenberg's The Fly and its sequel, The Fly 2, directed by Chris Wallace. And joining me is an up-and-coming content creator and good friend who prefers to keep his name anonymous for this podcast, but happily wanted to jump on the discussion and shares a fondness for mad science and grotesque body horror.
Let me become your major project. I'm talking about a book, not a magazine article. Follow me and my work day by day in as much detail as you can stand. I don't have a life, so there's nothing for you to interfere with. Research the background. Cover the process. A complete record of the most earth-shattering invention ever. The one that ended all concepts of transport, of borders and frontiers, of time and space. And your book will end with me transporting myself 15 feet through space from one telepod to another. That's what's really missing.
All right, how you doing, man?
I am doing great. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. At least doing the best I can in the times we live in. I guess maybe we should backtrack a little bit and talk just very briefly about The Fly from 1958 before we really dive into the 80s remake and its sequel, which you saw recently. I rewatched. I hadn't seen it for a very long time, and you know, I think it's very easy to sort of say that the Cronenberg remake of The Fly is usually the better of the two, but even then, I think the original has enough of an identity and sort of a fun charm to it, like also being this murder mystery, horror, sci-fi monster hybrid that I found a lot to love revisiting, and I'd forgotten that it takes like 30 minutes to even get into the whole Fly and pod plot setup. What did you think of it when you watched it initially?
Well, so I have to start off with saying that I'm new to all these films, actually, and so I'd say I was shocked at the quality of the Cronenberg Fly. To be honest, I was shocked at all the films for different reasons. The 1958 one, I was surprised at how good it was and how serious it was compared to maybe how we in the modern day see those kind of older, maybe hokey, cheesy films. Yeah, I liked it, but I have to say the Cronenberg one, that definitely took the spotlight for me.
It does for most people. I do like how in the original, well, first off, it's colorized, and the sequels, I believe The Curse of the Fly and, Return of the Fly and Curse of the Fly went back to black and white, and that goes to show at the time that they were much lower budget and they just didn't do as well as the original. And it's also based on I think it's a French short story from the 50s, which is why all the characters all have these French names, but only the inspector seems to be putting in the effort to actually have a French accent. Everybody else is kind of just talking like their normal self.
Yeah, I was surprised to hear that story was so recent. You know, the short story of The Fly compared to when, 1958 when it came out. Because when you think of The Fly, at least when I think of The Fly, I think of the larger, even just beyond the technical brand of Universal monster movies, even compared to Universal, that even just the literature of it was fairly new. So I'm surprised, honestly, it even got off the ground as quickly as it did.
And all versions that we've seen so far, that I've seen, I have not seen the sequels to the 58 movie, but they all do have a tragic element to them that, I mean, you could compare it to Frankenstein maybe to some degree, but I do like that each of these stories kind of shows, a scientist that kind of went a little bit off the deep end and really wants to regain that humanity. And honestly can't, which is the sad part to, I guess, the story. I haven't read the short story, but that was the sort of the general feel I was getting from each of the movies. I don't know if you felt the same way.
No, definitely, definitely. I mean, this is very congruent with the sort of transformation-based monster. Something like, I guess, Frankenstein, being made out of dead people, but even something like Dracula, the Wolfman, even something like the Invisible Man, gaining the ability to become invisible. And I think that's what makes this story, in virtually all its forms, so valuable. Is it's not telling a totally alien story. It's very easy for people to enter into and empathize with the various versions of the Fly, and how it or he is human, but is also something different in a metaphorical sense and a literal sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. We'll segue, I guess, over to the Cronenberg movie and get more in depth with that. But I wanted to ask real fast, have you seen many Cronenberg movies, or is this the only one that you're familiar with so far?
Yeah, no, I have to concede the cinema expertise over to you. I'm bad with the various directors' names. I am not very experienced in the history of film, and so, especially in this case, it was very recent that I learned the kind of nature of Cronenberg and his films, what he's known for, what he tries to go for. But yeah.
Well, The Fly is definitely usually a good start for people who are getting into his films. It's definitely one of the more palatable and approachable, despite it being rather gory and disgusting in places. But it is a good, clever introduction, because it's one of two of his films, the other being the Stephen King adaptation of The Dead Zone with Christopher Walken, both of those being very much more akin to Hollywood, whereas most of his films, he's a Canadian filmmaker, are a little bit more on the independent scene. Usually when people bring up Cronenberg, those are the first couple that I see normally pop up first. But his other movies, Videodrome is one of my favorites, Scanners is a classic, Naked Lunch is really good. He would later on, I would say towards the turn of the 2000s, kind of veer into more dramas and crime thrillers. He did Crash, he did A History of Violence, Eastern Promises, and then his last film that I'm aware of is a film called Maps of the Stars, which I do want to see at some point, but apparently that sort of cements Hollywood in a nutshell from his perspective, and just the horrid nature of Hollywood, which I'm kind of curious to eventually see. But that's just giving you kind of a sense of like his filmography over the years. I would recommend a lot of his films that I've seen already, but definitely worth the dive. Let's go ahead and just get right into The Fly. I love how this film opens with Jeff Goldblum, who is already on a mission to not necessarily work on his invention right now, but to just get the girl. He wants to meet somebody. He's definitely a lonely sort of recluse who doesn't get out much, but you do see a passion, you do see sort of a keen interest in what he does, and trying to sort of like an independent voice who really wants to change the world.
In my opinion, it's great casting. The opening of the movie, it's hard to tell if this is entirely purposeful, but it is very symbolic of that age of film where it is opening up. It's got a little slice of rom-com. It kind of lets you into the era for people like us who didn't exist back then. We get to see a little bit, and it's totally innocuous. If someone didn't tell you what this movie was about, I doubt that they could predict what it would turn into. And I think that's part of the beauty of the opening, is how grounded the film is at the start, and how it's not overcomplicated, even when he's explaining the science, as hokey as it can be with explaining the computer outputting kind of ridiculous things, or ridiculous interpretations that a computer couldn't make about the science, or about kind of Star Trek teleportation, basically. But yeah, I thought it was a very quaint opening, and it was perfect to set up a movie that would be dynamic going forward.
It's charmingly deceiving, which is how I would probably describe it. And yeah, as you said, it's a small enough scale where you just need really these three central characters to all sort of butt heads and keep it simple. It doesn't overcomplicate itself. And what I've noticed with some of Cronenberg's films is that they do get a little complicated in parts. You have to kind of really pay attention to what people say and do, especially when it comes to the more biological, scientific, or philosophical notes that he likes to throw into his scripts. Whereas The Fly, yeah, keeps it pretty base level, and it's simple, but it's not oversimplified. It's still, it's still pretty mature, and even takes the hokiness to a somewhat interesting sort of level where you can sort of ride this train and still stick with it. It's funny to see all these tests sort of run amok, because we learned that Seth Brundle is basically this underling to Bartok Industries. They're funding a lot of these projects that they don't even know he's working on. They're probably providing the baboons, and I like that, at such a small scale, that's all you kind of really need to build the world for this character, who's constantly just tampering with all the equipment they provide to him. Before the Fly transformation starts to really take course, did you buy a lot of these relationships, and did you think they were pretty effective?
Oh yeah, I mean it translates directly into things that we see every day, and that's what I think what made it so powerful is this personalization. She is, she's, I guess, beginning this relationship with Brundle. She's working with or for her former lover, and it's not impossible to understand. It's very simple, brilliantly so, but they're able to sort of play off our preconceived notions of what kind of drama that we're used to in a daily setting, in order to expedite the process of understanding and empathizing with these characters and their dynamics, which is so important for, kind of a horror or science fiction film. So I think that was done absolutely brilliantly.
I would agree, and I think the performances really do shine really well. I don't think they originally wanted Jeff Goldblum in this role, but I'm glad it ended up being the major pick. Yeah, if we go back to the tragic angle of it, just to see how this deteriorates a man who kind of goes a little off the edge. Obviously, the set-off point is when he gets a little drunk off of maybe a quarter bottle of champagne and decides to, teleport himself in his own machine, and that little fly just sneaks right in and just completely screws everything over. I do love that there's this progression where we just start to see just the ticks of how a fly would behave, but it still works to Jeff Goldblum's performance, who's already kind of an awkward sort of gentleman who has kind of fly-like ticks and pauses, and his utterances, his way of speaking, it's very much him both on and off screen, and I think this plays to probably it being one of his strongest performances of his career, especially under the amount of makeup that he has to wear over the course of the film. He still sells every bit of it. I just love how it sort of devolves into this gross monstrosity, this bug-like demon that eventually at the very end, of course, as we know, just wants to die because everything is not gone his way.
Yeah, in a sense, it's like that the whole movie. And when we're thinking about it like a tragedy, in the beginning, he's sort of like in this bliss, in this unawareness that he is a sort of outsider of society. He is this abnormally intelligent person who has weird quirks, like he's wearing the same exact set of clothes every single day. And and he has to deal with being an outsider in his job, having to do the experiments that he really wants in secret. He has to be an outsider when he's encountering these journalists, because he's not willing to play the game. He really cares about what he's doing. He doesn't want to screw it up for some kind of public stunt. And it carries over throughout the entire film until the very end, where it's this finale of a similar theme, where it's rhyming the whole time, kind of getting more and more profound. And in some sense, especially after rewatching it, you kind of feel the impending doom, which really classifies him as a kind of mad scientist, where in the beginning his circumstances are unfortunate, but as the movie goes along, more and more of the tragedy instills it inside of him, and he becomes less and less Brundle.
Yeah. And you see this a little bit in the 1958 film too, but that battle with oneself too, where you're like a hybrid and you're turning into something you're not, but you're still trying to retain every bit of your own humanity in the process. Even at the very, very end, you know that there's still a little bit of Brundle in him to say, pull the trigger. It's very operatic in a way, and I don't know if you knew this, but Howard Shore, who did the score for this film and does the score for most of Cronenberg's movies, actually adapted loosely The Fly for the opera and had David Cronenberg direct that. I have not seen this opera, but it definitely, just given the small scale locations and the three main characters, it lends itself to an opera very well the more I think about it.
Yeah, I have not. I did not know it was an opera. I've not heard of that. But it does make sense in a sort of... I've seen a little bit of how studio sitcoms are done in a very small space, but it's made to look, like if it's a house, a very large space or something. And so in some ways that makes a lot of sense. That would be very interesting to watch. Yeah, the music was another thing I was blown away by. It's very iconic, very powerful.
Opens on a perfect stinger. Again, these characters are always kind of evolving. We see the Stathis character sort of evolve enough where he's a little bit more present for Veronica when she's in a bit of disarray, just given the conditions that Seth Brundle is going through and how it's affecting her and their relationship, and then seeing just kind of a switch for the Stathis character to become a little bit more, I don't know if I'm going to go so far as compassionate, but sympathetic and willing to help when things kind of turn awry. When she has that nightmare sequence of the
larva. Yeah, the larva. yeah. Well, as far as Stathis, I loved that we didn't just get, we didn't get what we thought what we were getting at the very beginning of the film. As I said, it was set up kind of like this seemingly predictable formula of him being the resentful ex-boyfriend, but it subverts our expectations in a reasonable way, and I really like that because it makes everything else so much more meaningful, because it's not easy. It's not easy for Stathis to just be ignored or even from a writing perspective written out of the conflict, because he isn't so black and white, and it's hard for us as viewers to judge him in a black and white way. I don't know, I really enjoy that kind of writing for characters where it's I wouldn't say it's gray morality, but it is. It's this switch back and forth between kind of good and bad, because there's so much of that in our nature, I think, that we like to forget, that switching back and forth.
And the fact that he has to sacrifice a hand and a foot in the process just goes to show the the sheer ferocity of what this fly can do when it's in its fullest form. What did you think of the special effects in this? Because they get pretty nasty in points.
Well, I do like. I mean, I love practical effects. I love how creatively they have demonstrated what the fly can do. When you think about other movies, like superhero movies like Spider-Man or something, and he's mutated and now we have to reveal what he can do slowly. This is a very, very different, in some ways not so different, but a very different unveiling of his powers, and it's shocking, and I think that's exactly what Cronenberg wanted, and that's what I wanted, out of this movie. I thought it was great. I thought it was terrifying. I thought it was inspiring, the levels that they were willing to go to demonstrate the what was happening underneath the surface of the film.
Yeah, CGI. I used to be very hard on a lot of CG artists in the past, and I've built up a little bit more of a sympathy through all the hard work they have to go through as well. Because a lot of times, whenever I'm critical of CGI in a more modern film, I don't ever really address or think about that maybe it's due to a producer decision, or they didn't have the time or the funding to perfect some of these effects the way they wanted to. I always try to consider that sometimes whenever I'm being fair. Judgmental towards a movie. But generally, yes, I do gravitate towards practical effects because it is there, it's in the flesh, it's on camera, and people are physically interacting with those effects or those creature designs. And it's just little details in this film, like in the harrowing climax when the fly basically zaps through the machine, breaks back out. You see this new sort of hybrid again, where he's a little bit more metallic looking, and obviously probably fused a little bit with his invention. And it's little details like that where they really definitely committed, and I commend the film for doing stuff like that.
Yeah, I don't hate CGI or anything like that, but and I do understand the kind of budgetary restrictions or just the kind of bureaucratic restrictions that may disable artists from going the full length that they want to go. But I think that definitely this movie, the way that it did the construction and the deconstruction of the suits and makeup, I think it really spoke to our disgust as viewers in an amazing way. I can't. There's so few films I think I can name that really go to the lengths that The Fly did.
Thank goodness it actually did really well too. I mean, as you said, it kind of plays to some of that disgust we kind of want to see on screen, even though it's not quite something you typically see now in the mainstream Hollywood sectors of cinema. But it's still, this kind of body horror is still alive and well, and there's always new voices who are also trying to build on it. Even Cronenberg's son is trying to follow in his dad's footsteps with the films he makes, though I'm not very well versed with his filmography. So you can definitely see there's a lot of inspiring notions throughout the course of this film that would have led to even more grosser looking movies as the years went on. That's really all I got really on The Fly. It is a classic. I don't know if there's anything else you want to piggyback off of there, but
not so much. I mean, I love the film. I think it provided a huge standard for all kinds of other films and expectations for other films to try to meet. And I think that some other films that came afterwards maybe didn't really follow up to those expectations.
My body is growing stronger. I feel
You don't know what you're saying.
I do know what I'm saying. Until now, I've been nothing more than an open wound. Defenseless, weak, vulnerable. Don't you see? I'm healing.
Well, now I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on 1989's The Fly 2, directed by Chris Wallace. I had seen this film once before, a long time ago, and remember not liking it very much. But upon rewatch, and maybe I was just kind of looking at it through a different lens, and in terms of where you would take a sequel that's pretty linear with the first film, but still kind of give it its own unique quality that's separate of the original and doesn't try to mimic the original and tell a different kind of story. This being more, being like a lab rat or guinea pig in a big government institution and trying to escape your fate and right the wrongs of these more, I guess you could say, established villains that are through and through evil. I thought it was pretty good. Not great. It's not as good as the Cronenberg film, obviously, but I found a lot to like in this sequel. I don't know if you felt the same way, if you have the same sort of sentiment, but I'm curious to know what you thought.
Well, based on what I was just saying, I don't even particularly strongly dislike this sequel, but in regards to its strengths, I mean, it does work with a lot of very interesting topics. You can tell that there were people who cared, who wanted to continue the story. That even the people maybe writing it wanted to see what happened next. And there were elements, there were ingredients in this film that I thought were really, really potent, very good ingredients for a film. But I think that where it really suffered was, I don't know any other way to put it, but just kind of the motivations and intelligence of some of the characters. Because I was watching and I kept thinking, why are they doing that? Why is this person doing this? Why is this set up in this way? What about this? What about that? And so I wanted to like it, and there were things I liked about it, but the way it all came together in the greater idea of the film, I felt like it just, the characters themselves, I feel like didn't hold it up. It's hard to compare to the original Fly, or the previous Fly. But I felt like if they had the same level of character writing, character motivations, and dialogue from the previous Fly, this would have been a great movie. But I think that it was an okay movie that had some really good ideas.
Yeah, it's definitely not a very highly regarded or well-regarded film at all compared to the Cronenberg film. I won't argue with the fact that, yeah, there is a kind of lack of competence with a lot of these characters. A lot of decisions they make don't quite add up, and I will say there's also just sort of a lack of gray areas as well. Like, they're pretty, at the end of the day, they are pretty stock and by the numbers. I guess why I still kind of like it is that I kind of went into the film sort of expecting that, just given how a lot of sequels to well-renowned horror films typically go. They get a little campier, they kind of play up some of the stakes, and one thing I will say I do appreciate is that it does not repeat at all what the first one did. It does take a new scenario where the son, who is born to not Gina Davis in that opening scene, that was some other actress, but I do think there, as you said, there are some cool ideas they are certainly experimenting with. A character like this who grows up really fast is slowly scientifically hitting a point where he will turn into the Fly. I think there was enough to sort of explore a character who kind of only had one life, basically living at Bartok Industries. There are points where he finally does discover the outside world, and he doesn't seem to be as wowed by what he sees, since this is the life he kind of grew up in. But there was never really enough time for the film to kind of get to that realization. It just keeps moving along and turns into, I guess, by the end, a revenge sort of tale, which is another aspect I did actually kind of like, that he is sort of taking out these people who wanted this to happen to him. I just wish, like you said, the characters were a little bit stronger, but I still thought the concept and the story was decent enough, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, I think what Cronenberg did in the previous film is he set it up so simply, as for what I was saying before, where the beginning of the film and just the concepts, the logic of the film overall is very, very simple, and it sort of creates this prism, and Cronenberg just shines a light through it and creates a whole spectrum of possibilities that are fascinating and interesting, but he doesn't go all the way with them, he doesn't exhaust them, he just has this simple beginning and tells combines this very human story with very inhuman concepts in a seemingly complicated way, but when the movie ends, it's understandable, and other than the baby, I guess it kind of wraps itself up. With this movie, I feel like it's the opposite. You're kind of trying to shove an entire spectrum of ideas into, one place. And what ends up happening is you can see where the sacrifices were made. And it's unfortunate because this director who led on the makeup and prosthetics and all that stuff, I think this was his first film, no?
I'll have to double check on that, but it might have been his first directorial debut. I'm at least relieved that you had somebody who was close to the first film's production to be the head on this one at the very least, but maybe he needed a little bit more collaborative supervision, I suppose, on just where they wanted to take the story, because I'm sure this was probably something they had in mind for a while, but as you said, they were juggling a lot of ideas in one big basket, and it's sometimes a little hard to kind of follow along. You see what they're trying to do, maybe they're trying to build a universe, and maybe they wanted to do more sequels, but it never got to that point, as we've seen.
Yeah, the Fly cinematic universe. Yeah, I liked the second movie, but there were things I also really didn't like about it, and I wish that it hadn't followed a sort of stereotypical path of great sort of 80s horror, and then the sequels try to too quickly to kind of do this thing where they try to expand it into this universe of all these different things going on, and at that point, you might as well just give people in the movie theater pamphlets to describe what's going on, because for the average moviegoer, I think that this is it's a little too much. It doesn't start off with this. It doesn't start off in reality. It starts off in The Fly, almost like it's just an expansion of the first movie. The first movie starts off, it's in reality. It's not in fantasy yet. It's not in fiction yet. And then they introduce science, and then people start mutating, all that jazz. But this movie sort of begins with that. The main character is this mutant who's he's 5 years old, and he's got a girlfriend or something. He's mutating into a fly. It's right from the get-go, and that I think that probably turned a lot of people off who saw it when it first came out, even to this day, even to me.
Did you recognize any of the cast too? Because there was Daphne Zuniga, who played the Beth Logan character, the love interest, who I've seen in Spaceballs. So I don't know if you recognized her from that, but she's Princess Vespa.
Yes. Yeah, I recognize that.
And then we got a little Jeff Goldblum cameo, or at least in 2 shots, which I thought was at least a little cute, that he recorded these videos for the for the sake of the second film that he probably didn't want to be part of. And the only actor that does return, which I'm surprised by, was the Stathis character for a brief scene. It was good to see him again, but he didn't really lend enough to the conversation other than, here, take my car, they won't find you in that vehicle. He doesn't really sort of establish anything really foundational other than, oh, he's seen what the Fly is capable of, and this is how I've been suffering ever since. I guess in hindsight, kind of pointless to have him back.
Yeah, I mean, there have been other 80s horror, action horror, something like that, where, like for example, Tremors, where a sort of more background character becomes the main character as the series goes on. But that's definitely not what happened here. What kind of happened to Stathis and Brundle is, they were definitely just cameos. I don't know. I just think this movie had too many ingredients. There's too many cooks in the kitchen.
I think we kind of agree there. I probably just liked it a little bit more just for the hokiness of it. I do also want to commend the effects in this film too, because just given the director's experience with these creature designs, I don't know how much involvement he had this time, but I do believe the creature effects will hold up well and get even nastier in some parts. Just when you see the Bartok villain sort of get his comeuppance at the very end, it's just this mutated boar just kind of trapped in a well for the rest of his life. It's such a, in some ways it's satisfying, but it's also just, it's so over the top. You sometimes question, like, all right, maybe we should draw a line here or something.
Yeah, well, I mean, I definitely think that that's one of the points of the film, is that kind of expression through the disgust that we mentioned earlier. The ending, well, I'll start before there. I think, like a lot of people, the dog part bothered me. But that's I guess kind of stereotypical for that to bother people more than when it happens to people. But the ending was almost in some ways like the opposite of the original Fly, and that was one thing that I kind of appreciated, where it was, instead of Brundle wanting to finally kill himself, basically, or have just, go out, not be this monster, the main villain in this movie is sort of condemned in a way. And there is kind of a rhyming scheme here that can be appreciated.
Goes to the lengths enough to differentiate itself, but there's also, there's patterns, and as we've always discussed, it gets a little overcomplicated in points. I'm also, the Martin Brundle character, he's okay, but I mean, if you're stacking him up against the charisma and the charm and just the overall performance that Jeff Goldblum gives, it's night and day. He's just not as up to par as a lead, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, that is unfortunate, because Jeff Goldblum carries a lot of the movie with how well he fits in, and his kind of quirky personality gets to bleed into his character, makes it believable, sets a kind of tone for the movie. In this, I'm not getting his aura like this. I'm not getting this energy that is memorable from the main character. It could just be, I don't know, his age, or just the writing itself for him. But yeah, he definitely. They didn't try to make his character like his father's, but at the same time, I don't think that he was sufficiently different. We were told how smart he was. We were told how in many ways he was like his father, but I didn't really get much out of that.
Yeah, we were explained in quite a lot of detail, but we weren't actually seeing that in reality. In fact, a lot of it gets shrouded in montages and sequences that sort of happen off camera that we just don't really know about. I think another thing is the pacing is a little bit awkward and stilted in this film too. I think it's about 15 minutes or so longer than the first film, and there are scenes where I could have cut some of the meat, where it just gets a little too, either a little too talky or just a little too
over-explanatory, I guess.
Yeah. I'll add too that the score, while I do like the composer Christopher Young who did this film score, doesn't quite hold a candle to Howard Shore's version, which is unfortunate. I appreciate it for doing something different. I see Christopher Young pop up in a lot of horror films too. He's big in that genre, and he's usually a go-to when they can't get somebody like a Danny Elfman or a Howard Shore. So he's like the second best.
Yeah, well, I don't feel so strongly about the second film, but I can see. I'm not so hard on it because I can see what they were trying to do, and I can understand that maybe they got a little bit overexcited with it.
Well, that's about all I have, I think, on the second film. It was interesting to revisit, and it's a cool relic of the time at the very least. And I certainly like it despite a lot of its faults. Just wish it could have gone into a more logical sort of progression if the story had to be told. Now, there is an interesting tidbit that Cronenberg years ago wanted to do sort of a loose sequel to The Fly, but it was more of a film that would kind of run parallel. So it was kind of, I guess you could say, a film that kind of exists in the universe of The Fly, but a completely different movie, which I wish he kind of went for. You could even make a claim that some of his films already feel like they belong in The Fly's universe, but you're just focusing on someone entirely different.
Well, yeah, a lot of his movies do have this theme of flesh, this themes of like fallenness around our bodies and physicality, and his self-expressed interest in, at least in part, in making The Fly was around disease, things like cancer, aging, from my understanding. And yeah, I don't know, that would be interesting if are there ties between his movies that are like referential?
Not that I've particularly picked up on. He'll sometimes have actors that he likes to work with return in multiple films. With most of his movies, there's always an angle about humanity and biology, and it's all of these interesting sort of dark but real fears that people actually do have. And I think Cronenberg has like sort of built his entire foundation in the cinematic landscape through those kinds of stories, and even the dramas and the crime thrillers he would do in his later years also kind of touch at just our violent or our emotional tendencies and where we are when it comes to sex or drugs or analyzing people for what they are. And you'll discover that more when you watch more of his movies, if you ever do.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I'm definitely gonna watch more of his movies because it is a unique vector to approach the kind of problem solution dynamic that happens over the course of the movies, and I'd like to see how he handles other scenarios, because I'm sure you're more aware of the scene that's trying today, the scene of filmmaking that's trying to do things like that, or maybe replicate some of what he's doing, maybe improve upon it. But from a more casual perspective, I don't really see other things. That the most maybe comparable to some of our criticisms of the second movie, something like Prometheus being a sequel to Alien. So kind of this body horror, aliens, mutants. these things that we want to shut out of our mind because we know that like there's stuff going on inside of our bodies.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that fear of the unknown. I would say a good modern filmmaker who kind of follows in Cronenberg's footsteps and certainly has some skin in the game in terms of making his films more mainstream is probably a guy like Alex Garland, who did the film Annihilation recently. He did Ex Machina. He wrote the script for 28 Days Later. He definitely taps into some similar subjects too, and you can see the creative influences from someone like Cronenberg or even John Carpenter and other experimental filmmakers out there too. I think there's enough people who, as we said, like definitely find a lot of influence through stories like this, and want to question the darker implications of what's possible with our human bodies and what can result from that.
Well, yeah, I've seen Ex Machina. I haven't seen the others that you mentioned, but Ex Machina was really good. It was interesting because it was like body horror, but it was not with a human body, and in some ways it was more like consciousness horror. It wasn't like psychological so much, in the same way that you would use that phrase, the psychological horror, but it was about this relationship between human and machine.
Yeah, and especially in the form of a lot of these, I guess you could say, more bottle thrillers where it's a little bit more contained and you have just like The Fly, just a very simple but strong 3-act structure with very condensed and few characters sort of running the ropes. And those to me are, in general, are the kinds of films I'm a little bit more drawn to. Maybe there's a low budget sort of angle to it that I just kind of relate to, and it is in a way how I write a lot of my projects. I kind of think loosely a little bit with a certain budget in mind, but I also don't like to overcomplicate things. If I can keep it relatively contained, I will usually shoot for that sort of story. But I also appreciate the people that decide to make their films as big and bombastic as possible too. It's a lot more risky, whether it's a budgeting thing or if you're casting and working with several production heads at once. It could work out or it could be a nightmare.
Yeah, well, I'm partial to that too, because I mean, even if it's not particularly, if it's not, like this massive saga where the world's gonna end and the team of heroes must assemble, or it's like the most profound revelation possible. I like that simple structure because it's the same thing that we were talking about with the sequel to the Cronenberg Fly. Is that the Cronenberg Fly had very few ingredients, but was able to make kind of a masterpiece from not a whole lot. As you said, this 3-act structure starts off very grounded, and it's not as experimental as it is. It plays it kind of close to the chest in the way that it's done, just as far as its structure and introduction. I think that's really what sold it to a lot of people.
And nowadays we get films like Annabelle 5 and Blumhouse nonsense.
Yeah, I haven't seen a new horror movie in quite a while, because to be honest, the way I see them is they're like movies made out of the dumb internet clips people would send each other to scare each other, like show a scary picture, play a loud sound. It's like, now that's a whole movie or a whole series. It's just, oh, something scary is behind the corner, boo, and then they just do that a few times and then charge you money.
I commend your avoidance of all a lot of the mainstream horror films that we get. There's always a few good ones that come out of the mix, but it's harder find any like really strong, memorable ones, at least on that scale. Most of the horror movies that I've liked of recent years have been usually lower budget indie films that want to tell a story that's a little bit more personal, or also just intimate. You know, if it's a small scale budget, I guess again there's a relatability to it, and I'd love it when filmmakers, you know, do so much with so little.
Yeah. I think ultimately what we're looking at when we see these larger, simplified, big budget Hollywood films, like these horror films, I think that we have to see them not necessarily that they're these horrible movies, but they're just not made for what maybe you want or what I want. You know, we want to have a movie that we can talk about. You know, I think most people, there's not necessarily anything wrong with this, but I think most people they want a movie that's equivalent to them just going out for a drink or something. You know, they just want to chill out and have something to do. And I think in order to get people more of what they want out of the movie experience, I think we need to kind of categorize movies a little bit differently. I think that this is what has happened with this, which I don't know a whole lot about. You might have to correct me, but I think that that's kind of the point of these indie films, is that they're just, it's a whole nother category because it's for a whole different purpose. It's not just a movie.
Sometimes the really risky implication of having a really successful indie film is that you now get contacted by all of these Hollywood execs who want you to produce the next Marvel film or what have you, blockbuster that's currently trending, and that's where I get a little antsy when I see filmmakers who started from rock bottom and made something really cool and then have to make, if that's what they want to do, that's their call, but it's always kind of a saddening image when that's the route they end up taking. Once in a while it could work out. It really just kind of depends on the storyteller and who you associate with.
Yeah, I think hopefully maybe when, well, I don't know. I hope that this dichotomy of indie films versus more mainstream films continues. Even if people leave one, go to the other, I think generally if we can view them as two different worlds and not a big mess of, you know, it's up to you to kind of, as an individual, to figure out which one is which for which situation. I think that then we'll be able to get, you know, mainstream movies to people who want that, and, you know, more experimental film. People are trying to push the boundaries, uncover things. In indie film, they'll be able to get that. And I really, at the end of the day, the only problem that I see is when some of these things cross over, as you said, where people, I guess, sell out. But yeah, hopefully we'll continue like this for a little while.
And I would say, to close, David Cronenberg definitely toes that fine middle line where he's done a couple bigger budget films, but he's always been a huge supporter of the independent Canadian film scene, and shot most of his movies, at least in Canada. I respect that he's fighting for filmmakers and other voices to get their stories and their films shared in that manner. So that's always a really respectable thing I've liked about the director and his career. He's probably retired, I believe, now. I'd have to read up on that, but yeah, he embodies that indie scene very well.
Yeah, it's very commendable.
Be afraid. Be very afraid.
Well, thank you so much for doing this, man. Is there anything you would love to plug for the listeners?
Well, you know, I would like to get involved in content creation. I haven't figured out exactly what name I'm gonna go by, or what kind of content it's gonna be, because I want to do so much. But The channel I will be making will be called Ancient of Days. I guess on the channel I'll explain what that means. But yeah, that's about it.
Awesome. We'll put a link in the bio for sure. And you can find me over at twitter.com at Jeremobie. You can also follow me on letterboxd.com to keep up with the films I watch, rate, review at Jeremobie. And you can also follow me over at Film Chow Productions on Facebook, where I'll continue to post new content when I can, as much as possible. All right. Thank you so much again for doing this, and thank you all for listening. Have a good night.